This is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. I hope you enjoyed this Critical Thought, your daily discussion on game design. Welcome to today's Critical Thought. As always, thank you so much for liking and subscribing to the channel. This is our first post 1,000 subscriber Critical Thought, and now that I know there's so many of you watching, I'm sure I'll be making more mistakes as stage fright sets in. For today's Critical Thought, this was the one I was going to talk about yesterday. It's kind of either the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning, kind of a discussion, and that is the talk about the baseline, or the baseline experience of your game. This is going to be one of those more philosophical topics, and it has to do with the core gameplay loop. For those of you who aren't familiar with that term, the core gameplay loop is essentially the absolute simplistic way of describing what your player is going to be doing, and it's going to be repeated over how many hours of your play. If we're talking about a Final Fantasy game, it's wandering the map and getting to turn-based battles. If it's Mario, it's running through a level, avoiding obstacles, getting to the end. Again, this is essentially what the player's going to be doing over and over and over again until the game is finished. Now, when it comes to the baseline, this is a term that I like to use to describe the absolute bare minimum it's going to take to play a game from start to finish. And there's two ways of looking at this, either from a player's skill perspective or an RPG abstraction numbers-based point of view. We'll start with the player's side. When it comes to the baseline for action or platforming games, this is essentially all the mechanics or skills the player is going to need to pick up. Double jumping, wall jumping, air dashing, run, jump, crouch, you name it. And the baseline from this point of view represents how you're going to extrapolate or build things out from here. We talked about this previously with level design such as in Metroidvania games, where once you've established or the player gets the double jump, for instance, from that point forward, level design has to make use of that and has to test the player. Now, with Metroidvanias, you can have elements before then, but that's another topic in of itself. But with the baseline, you need to be able to establish the foundation of skills that the player is going to learn and what's going to be required upon them. Now, we're not going to be talking about post-content or post-gameplay here, either with action games or with RPGs, the optional Shin Megami Tensei Uber bosses that can kill you. Now, with this kind of baseline motto, whatever you establish as it must remain the foundation of your game. Whenever you change or upset your baseline, it's going to affect all aspects of your game going forward. When it comes to the action side of things, if you introduce new concepts that aren't properly explained or aren't properly given the time to breathe, you can have situations where the player will be thrown into a case where they'll be required to do something without having any idea that it's even available in the game. For instance, if you're going to introduce the concept of air dashing, and that's available from the start, but you have no in-game explanation for it, they're not even going to realize that's an option. And having pits that are too wide to jump without any explanation is not a suitable answer to that. This also leads into the concept of organic tutorial design, which we talked about previously as a way of teaching the player without stopping the game. Now, with abstracted mechanics or abstracted games, the baseline represents the numerical side. What level am I going to have to be to beat the final boss? What's going to be my attack value, my defense, etc.? Some games adhere to this more strongly than others. For instance, when we're playing a fully turn-based RPG, and it simply is a numbers fight, then there is a bare minimum you're going to need. If we're talking about games that have action and RPG elements, there is some wiggle room. I know there are people who play Soulsborne and they go out of their way to have the lowest soul level or blood level, whatever you want to say, as possible. Now, when it comes to RPG design, you need to be very careful, again, of adjusting or making changes to this baseline. This is all the more important when we're talking about hard numbers. If, for instance, my starting health is 10, then you don't want to reduce enemies or up enemies' attack values to make them do 15, 20 points of damage from the offset, because that's a one-hit kill. And what happens is if you make those adjustments to the baseline, again, they have to be carefully managed throughout the rest of your design. And there's an interesting case in point, but I need to take a sip of water first because I am very dry today. The example comes from the Darkest Dungeon. And Red Hook ran into a little bit of some heated debates during their early access. What happened was, about halfway through, they adjusted the game to have corpses and the heart attack mechanics, which were not in the original form of the Darkest Dungeon. This was to offset the fact that many people were saying the Darkest Dungeon was too easy. Yes, for those of you watching, there are people who think Darkest Dungeon is an easy game. But what ended up happening was that it frustrated a lot of people because they adjusted the baseline of the game without adding any forms of compensation. So what happened was you had cases where players were getting easily killed due to high stress damage, and then of course the heart attack knocking them out, and then the corpse mechanic delaying fights and pushing these further, which was also compounded by the fact that if you take too long to kill an enemy encounter, more enemies will join the fight and you'll take additional stress damage. And then you of course had the issue of enemies who were in their best position to... Wow, my mouth just completely dried there. Who were in their best position to do their strongest attacks, and they weren't being moved because the corpses were blocking them. And of course, this is something that the player had to deal with that the enemy simply could avoid because you don't have corpses on your side. So what ended up happening is Red Hook had to adjust again their baseline for their stats and their mechanics, including adding in corpse removal with certain skills. The Leper, the Occultist, I'm forgetting the rest off the top of my head. The Bounty Hunter could pull enemies and upset corpses that way. But what ended up happening is whenever you have to adjust your baseline, everything on top of it will have to be adjusted and affected. Because again, your baseline or your core gameplay loop is your foundation. Now, one of the interesting ways designers have gone around this is with what I like to call supplemental content or module design. What that is instead of throwing everything onto your baseline, instead you create supplemental systems or additional content that modify or grow your game outward without impacting your baseline. And really good examples of this would be the improvements from XCOM Enemy Within and what they did to Enemy Unknown. They added new systems that sat on top of the baseline without impacting it. AI Wars from Arkham Games is another really good example of that. What they've done is over the course of, I don't even know how many patches, DLC, and expansions, is add in new content on top of their baseline. The bare minimum of what you need to learn and play with AI Wars hasn't changed all that much in terms of basic skills. But what they've done is grow things on the other end or on top of it. This is another example of what we've seen with MMOs recently that have lowered their leveling curves. The Division, DC Universe Online, and I'm sure there are others. What they've done is, instead of requiring a very wide leveling curve and having to make adjustments to the baseline to compensate by, adding in more levels and stuff like that, what they do is keep the level very short, thereby keeping a very basic core gameplay loop and baseline. So what ends up happening is most of their players are going to hit the leveling cap. And this allows them to then expand things out further from there with more systems, more modules, there we go. My mouth is completely parched right now, too much talking today. But it grows things out on that front, and so they can experiment and add new content without fear of adjusting the baseline. They know once you hit the leveling curve or leveling cap, that you know what the game is all about. You know how the systems work, you know how the game is played. So now they can extend things out with more content and more unique things. With The Division, for instance, two of their endgame content or DLC pieces have added in a new survival mode, a procedurally generated dungeon in the subway, and I'm sure they're going to add more when the time comes. This is different from a game like Payday 2, which they have adjusted their baseline dramatically over the last, I guess it's been about 2-3 years at this point. They've completely redone their skill trees. They've of course added in the infamous system, perk decks, melee weapons, throwables, and all kinds of new stuff. And what ends up happening is, again, they've had to readjust their baseline. This includes adjusting the difficulty settings, adding in new tutorials, and spreading all the weapons and items throughout their level cap. So what happens is now every time you level in Payday 2, you're going to unlock something new because there are all that new content. Of course, there is the greater discussion as to whether or not it's balanced, and my goodness, if we start talking about that, that's, who knows, we'll be here all night. But let's wrap things up here. So to summarize, your baseline, again, is your foundation. As a game developer, the quicker you establish your baseline and core gameplay loop, the easier it's going to be to develop your game further out, because you'll be able to rely on this as your guidelines and as your architecture for all your decisions going forward. Now, with that said, of course, I'm sure many developers are ready to point out that things will change. Very few games will survive intact from beginning to end. There will always have to be some kind of adjustments, either minor or major. But there is a greater critical thought in place regarding having to design your game systems at the same time you're building it, as what we've talked about previously with a game like Renowned Explorers. But that's going to be another critical thought. And as I always say, if you have suggestions or topics you would like to see covered in this vlog, let me know in the comments below. There is one that someone suggested a few days ago that I am going to be talking about, and I'm sure it is going to get me into trouble when I do. But if you have any other suggestions, be sure to let me know below. But to quickly wrap it up, again, with your baseline, once it's been established, try your damnedest not to change it. The point of the baseline is that things have to grow and extrapolate out from it. Whenever you make adjustments and completely change it, you are effectively changing all aspects of your game. And one of the big killers is when developers have to make those changes and then everything gets torn down and they have to build it back up again, which means more time and more money. And this can lead into those almost infinite game design periods that we've seen with games like Duke Nukem Forever and sometimes on the early access side. But let's end things here. As always, thank you so much for watching and enjoying the content. Again, be sure to like and subscribe and all that great stuff. Check back tomorrow for more content here and on GameWisdom.com, where we examine the art and science of games. Once again, I am Josh Bycer. Be sure to check back on the Twitch stream tonight as we'll be doing more Bloodborning. And otherwise, I will see you all tomorrow. Take care. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and of course share with your friends. It always helps out. For daily posts on all manner of game design and industry topics, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the site and everything that I do, be sure to check out the Patreon campaign. If we can hit goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy, and I'll be able to support myself and my household. If you want to follow me, you can find me on Twitter at GWBycer for updates throughout the day and random thoughts from me. And lastly, you can find me on Twitch right over there at GWBycer for daily streams most nights around 10 Eastern. Thanks again for watching the video, and be sure to check out more great content coming to the Game Wisdom channel real soon.